This hour, President Trump is meeting with the president of Vietnam in Hanoi. In just a few hours, he'll have his first face-to-face meeting with Kim Jong-un of this summit. The two leaders scheduled to hold their second summit to discuss nuclear weapons tomorrow. Donald Trump is apparently alone among members of his own government in believing North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat. Most experts can't really imagine the secretive, duplicitous, dark state ever really doing that. Sources tell NBC News the U.S. could offer incentives to North Korea, like negotiating a formal end to the Korean War, easing minor sanctions, and opening up a bare-bones diplomatic outpost. Two of our own journalists, Carol Lee, who joins us later in the hour, and Courtney Kuby, who covers the Pentagon for us, report this, quote, some senior Trump administration officials and others involved in the negotiations are worried that establishing diplomatic outposts and agreeing to an end of a war declaration, in addition to a second presidential meeting for Kim, would amount to de facto U.S. recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state. Well, with us here in Washington to talk about it, Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon, and Andrea Mitchell, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent, and, of course, the host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, weekdays here on MSNBC. Good evening. Welcome to you both. Andrea, let's start with the atmospherics. The video before this even started. You have Kim Jong-un stopping for a cigarette break and his sister, as one does, following him around with a crystal ashtray.
You would do that for your sister.
I would, but I mean, who are you going to trust in that country but your sister to be the carrier of the ashtray? And then getting off the train after a 68-hour, first of all, if you want to spend 68 hours on a train, take Amtrak from Seattle to San Francisco. But I kid. 68 hours on a train, in part because of the threat of assassination, and in part because of the shortage of dependable aviation equipment in that country. That gives you the setting for these two guys to sit down.
It's a perfect metaphor. The need, the economic need, the sanctions have hurt, but there's also cheating from China and Russia playing on both sides against the middle. And there is sort of a metaphor there, and it may be more than symbolic, of him going through China, through Chinese territory, paying respect to China on the way to this critical showdown with the leverage that China uniquely holds over whether any deal will ever be consummated or obeyed. And yet, at the same time, the cult of personality, cultivated, of course, by Kim Jong-un and his entire dynasty going back 3 generations.
It's a state and a cult, really.
And what do we have here? We have a president of the United States who believes he is uniquely capable, through his own personality, of somehow breaking through, as no other president has, with that shiny Nobel Prize as the allure over the horizon.
Started to talk about it. Jeremy Bash, do you fear the degree to which Trump feels the need to emerge with a deal of some sort?
I do. I think the result in Hanoi is actually already known, which is that our president has accepted North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. And by that, I mean, in 2017, under the umbrella of Trump's tweet storm, you know, my button is bigger than your button and Rocket Man, the North actually flight tested an ICBM twice. They detonated a nuclear device. They overflew Japan twice. They showed the world and themselves that they have the technological capability to threaten the western part of the United States. And with that as their arsenal, they proceeded to play rope-a-dope with our president. And now, with those nuclear weapons intact, and again, they've actually destroyed 0 nuclear weapons since the June Singapore summit. They've destroyed no nuclear material. They've destroyed not a single ICBM. They stand on the world stage with an American president, and they are ready to get an amazing number of concessions from the United States.
Let's put the president's tweet on the screen. We're quoting it at the bottom of the screen. He called Kim Jong-un his friend tonight. Andrea, just that will put cold water in the veins of all the foreign policy professionals that you know in this city.
And just think of the one issue that's never discussed in the Trump administration, which is human rights. Human rights, the gulags, the prisoners. We're no longer hearing about Otto Warmbier, the one individual, or the millions who have been slaughtered. And to say that, and as Jeremy says, he is accepting the the status quo of a nuclear-powered state. We have not seen an inventory. We have not seen even a definition of denuclearization, which was the going-in argument that there was not going to be a phased-out ordinary arms control negotiation. You do this, we'll do this, and eventually we get here with inspections, with verification. But initially it was going to be, we're getting everything up front, which they claimed to get, and to the shock of then Defense Chief Mattis, he even agrees or suggests to give up the joint military exercises, which are critical for readiness and have still not taken place since Singapore.
And Jeremy, what part of North Korea do you think is going to agree once and for all to give up on their cherished nukes, say nothing of the artillery that is the day-to-day threat to Seoul, South Korea, all those tubes packed on all those mountainsides, hundreds of them, ready, aim, and fire away from hitting South Korea?
Actually, probably tens of thousands of those artillery tubes, probably 40,000 that are within range of Seoul, as you referenced. And not only in range of Seoul, but in range of U.S. troops that are there in Seoul and throughout the peninsula, not only guarding the security of our ally, South Korea, but actually promoting U.S. interests in the region. So I think we're a long way from peace, although, of course, that's ultimately what Kim Jong-un seeks. He seeks acceptance. He seeks the world stage with an American president. He seeks the relief of sanctions so he can feed his own people. And I'm sorry to report that he's going to get many of those things without making a single solitary concession. And I fear, Brian, I think this is kind of the elephant in the room, that in light of what's happening in Washington tomorrow with the Cohen hearing, the president's going to be more eager to please, more eager for a headline, more eager to get a big show and a headline out of the summit. He's going to cave harder and faster than he really should.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.